Hello, today we are going to be reviewing solving square root equations. So whenever you're solving an equation and you're trying to get the variable by itself and your variable is to the second power, all that you need to do is do the opposite of squaring something, and the opposite of squaring something is square rooting it. Okay, so your step is square rooting on both sides. So squared and square root would cancel, so we're left with s is equal to, and then when you take the square root of 81, you do get 9 because 9 times 9 is 81, but something that we are learning in class is when you actually take the square root of 81, you get what we call plus or minus 9. Because the plus means positive 9, so as we know, 9 times 9 is 81, but you can also get negative 9, because negative 9 times negative 9 is also 81, because as we know, a negative times a negative is a positive. So when you take the square root of a number and we're telling you to solve it and check your solutions, you don't just get a positive anymore, you also get a negative. So we do something that's called the plus minus sign. Okay? And that's your answer. So the next one, so t squared, again, to get rid of that square, the opposite of squaring something is square rooting it. And whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other side. So then when you take the square root of 36, you do get that number 6, but remember you also can have it negative. So you do the plus minus sign, and then it would equal 6. So this just means positive 6 and negative 6. Alright, next one. So same thing, get rid of that squared sign by square rooting it on both sides, and you would be left with x is equal to square root of 49 would be 7, because 7 times 7 is 49, and negative 7 times negative 7 is also 49. Okay, so whenever you get to the higher numbers, you can use your calculator. So every calculator here is different. I actually just have a square root sign that I can press. Most calculators, though, wherever your x squared button is, there's like a little square root sign that should be above it. So you'll have to hit your second button or minus shift and then your x squared button, and then that would also bring up your square root key. Okay. So if you have a hard time finding it, maybe look it up on Google, or you can always ask your teacher whenever you see them about where your square root key is at. Okay. So we're going to get z by itself here. So the opposite of squaring is square rooting. So when you square root both sides, when we take the square root of 256, your calculator is only going to give you the positive. So you guys just need to remember that it can also be a negative. So you're going to get the plus minus sign and then 16. Okay, so then the next two, so again, we're just going to be square rooting both sides to get y by itself. So the square root of 900 is plus minus 30. Then same thing for number 6, opposite of squaring something is square rooting to get h by itself. They're inverse operations of each other. So then the square root of 1024 is plus minus 32. So main concept here, guys, to get rid of the squared, you just take the square roots. So you're doing the inverse operation of squaring, which is square rooting. And then you're still taking our square roots like normal of numbers, so you still get that 9. You just have to remember that plus minus sign because you guys need to understand that it's not just a positive 9 anymore, it's also a negative 9 that also equals a positive number. Okay. Alright, so now whenever you take the square root of fractions, so if you have your fraction here that you're going to square root to get n by itself, you're just doing it to both the numerator and the denominator. And then you're leaving your answer as that fraction. So square root the n squared so that you can get n by itself. The square root of 49 is plus minus 7. And the square root of 64 is 8. So you leave it, your answer, and for the square root of 49 in the numerator, leave your answer for the square root of 64 in your denominator, and then just put the plus minus sign out front. So the square root of 49 over 64 is plus minus 7/8. Okay, same thing with number 8, square root both sides, and whenever you're square rooting a fraction, you just square root the numerator and you square root the denominator. So we are going to be left with x equals, don't forget your plus minus sign when you're solving with square rooting, and the square root of 25 is 5, square root of 121 is 11. So your answer here is plus or minus 5/11. Okay, then same thing here for number 9, square root both sides, you get your numerator, you get your denominator. So the square root of 1 is 1, and square root of 100 is 10. So we would get plus or minus 1/10. All right, the next portion here is just estimating to the nearest integer. So we do something that's called approximating square roots. So if I were to give you guys a number line here, and I'm just going to go up to 6, and if I were to actually change all of our numbers on the number line into their perfect squares, we would get the square root of 0, square root of 1, square root of 4, square root of 9, 16, 25, 36, and so on. So all that I'm doing to get these square root numbers is just taking their perfect squares. So like 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16, and so on, because if you were to take the square root of these numbers, you would get these numbers on the number line. So what we do to approximate is, if I tell you guys the square root of 5, you're looking at our perfect square roots and you're trying to figure out, where does the square root of 5 fall? Well, it falls in between 4 and 9, right? Square root of 5 falls in between the 4 and the 9. So that means that the square root of 5, if I were to plug it in my calculator, it's going to be a number between 2 and 3. And square root of 5 is actually closer. Okay, sorry about that. So the square root of 5 is closer to the square root of 4 than the square root of 9. So if I were to round this to the nearest integer, I'm going to assume that my integer is going to be 2. And then I can double check that with my calculator here. So when I take the square root of 5, I get 2.2, and I would round it down to 2. So there is a way to do this without your calculator, and I do want you guys to try and do it without your calculator first. And then you can use your calculator to double check it, okay? So like, let's try the next one, square root of 18. Looking at my perfect square roots, the square root of 18 would fall in between the square root of 16 and the square root of 25. And then the square root of 18 would be closer to the square root of 16. So if I were to round it to the nearest integer, I'm assuming that I would round it down to 4. So let's use our calculator and double check. I get 4.2, so like I said, if I round it, I would round down to 4. Oh, and I'm also forgetting my plus minus signs here. Sorry about that. Alright, and then square root of 10. So square root of 10 would fall in between square root of 9 and square root of 16. Square root of 10 is closer to the square root of 9, so I'm going to assume that I'm going to round it to 3, so plus minus 3. So let's see what we get here. So square root of 10 is 3.1, so I would round it down to 3. Alright, and then number 4, so this negative sign out front means that they want our negative answer. So when we take the square root of 34, notice how it's going to be in between 5 and 6, and it's also going to be closer to 6. So I'm going to guess here that the square root of 34 is going to be closer to 6, and I am correct, because 5.8 would round up to 6. And then I know that you guys haven't seen something like this before. All that this means is you're going to take the square root of 53 first, and then you're just going to multiply it times 4. So if I were to take the square root of 53, that's about 7.28, and then multiply it times that 4. Notice how it already changes it for me in my calculator. you would get the 29.1. So if we round that, that would be 29. Okay. All right, so we are going to use this to plot numbers on the number line. And let's see where they want us to plot them. I'm going to assume that this is -5. So -5, -4, -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yep, I believe that's how they want us to plot this one, just looking at the numbers. Okay, so whenever you guys go to plot these, I always label them by capital letters so that I'm not trying to write all these numbers on my number line. I'm just going to plot a dot and then correspond it with the letter that I have up here. So like A is -3.2145. So you start at 0, go over -3, and then you go over 0.2 more. So A would be somewhere in this region. B, the square root of 7. So again, if I'm using my number line up here, square root of 7 falls in between 4 and 9, and it's just a little closer to the square root of 9. So I'm going to put it in between that 2 and 3, but just a little bit closer to the 3. So that would be B. C, 1 and 7/8. So I know that 8/8 would make 1 whole, so that means that it's going to be pretty close to 2, but not all the way. So 1 and 7/8 would be approximately right here, in between 1 and 2, a little bit closer to 2. And then negative square root of 24. So the square root of 24 is very close to the square root of 25, which equals 5. So its negative would just mean I would be over here on the negative side. So again, it's going to be close to -5, but not all the way there yet. So D would be somewhere in that region. Okay, so notice how I didn't even use a calculator. So this is what you guys are expected to be able to do at this point in time. Okay, so just try not to use your calculator. You can use your calculator to double check your answers, okay, but really try to do it without. All right, so next one. So the square root of 2 would fall in between 1 and 2, but it's going to be closer to 1. But if you were to multiply it times 2, you are going to be somewhere in like the 2 to 3 region. So let's double check to see where we're closer at. So when you multiply it times 2, so when you take the square root of 2 times 2, you get 2.8. So we're not all the way to 3, but we are pretty close. So it looks like we only have positive numbers, so I'm just going to start at 0. So the 2 times the square root of 2 was that 2.8. So again, I'm going to label my A, B, C, D. So I'm going to go over 2 and almost to 3, but not all the way. So there's my A. B is 4 and 2/3. So if you were to figure out what 2/3 equals, 2 divided by 3 is 0.6 repeating. So I'm just a little bit over halfway. So this would be about 4.6. So I'm going to go over 4, and then 0.6 would be about halfway here. So that's B. Pi, if you guys forget, pi is approximately 3.14. So I'm going to go over 3 and just a little bit over to the right. So that would be C. And then the square root of 50. So if I were to extend my number line here, that would be 49, and this would be 56. So the square root of 50 would fall in between the square root of 49 and the square root of 56. And the square root of 50 would be a lot closer to 49 than 56. So I'm going to plot my number between 7 and 8, and then just keep it a little bit more closer to 7. And there's our number lines. Alright, backside. So we are going to select all of the following solutions to the equations. Round your answers to the nearest integers. Okay, so again, whenever you're solving and you're trying to get x by itself, and what it's doing right now is squaring. The opposite of squaring is square rooting. And remember, when you square root a number, you're going to get that plus minus sign, okay, because it can be the positive and the negative answer to that solution. So if we were to take the square root of 80, we get about 8.9. So if we round that to the nearest integer, that would give us plus minus 9. So that means that our answers here would be B and D. Alright, so then same thing for number 17. Again, opposite of squaring something is square rooting. It's the inverse operation. So we're going to square root both sides. And when you're solving and you're square rooting, you're going to get that plus minus sign. So then the square root of 220 is about 14.8. So again, if we round that to the nearest integer, we're going to round up since 8 is greater than 5. And that is going to give us plus or minus 15. So that would be A and D. Alright guys, so this next question, you do need to know this question, okay? I believe it does appear on a quiz or a test for my class. So whenever I'm asking you guys how many square roots does 25 have, I'm wanting you guys to interpret the plus minus sign, okay? Because I taught you guys today, when you take the square root of a number, you don't just get the positive number, you also get the negative. So how many square roots does 25 have? 25 has 2 square roots because, and then you're just explaining your solutions. So the square root of 25 is 5, so 5 times 5 equals 25, and negative 5 times negative 5 equals 25. So you're pretty much just explaining that 25 has 2 square roots, they're the positives and they're the negatives. Okay, so that's really what I'm looking for in your answer here. Alright, so then last one is just dealing more with the multiplications with the square roots. So again, we can just use our calculator for this. Mine calculator is pretty easy because I can just write it as it is on the paper. Some of you guys, depending on your calculator, might have to do the square root of 10 first and then multiply it by 3. So it really just depends on your calculator that you have. So 3 times the square root of 10 is about 9.5. So I'm just going to write it right above. And then 7 times the square root of 3 is about 12.1. So which one is bigger? Obviously the 12.1, so we would need the less than symbol. Alright, and then same thing here, so 11 times the square root of 7 is about 29.1, and then 7 times the square root of 11 is about 23.2. So the one that's the biggest is 11 times the square root of 7, so we would need the greater than sign. Alright, so that is pretty much it for notes today. So the main thing that I want you guys to get from this lesson is whenever you're solving, so whenever you're solving equations and you have to take the square root on both sides, just remember that you need to include that plus minus sign because there's 2 solutions now when you're square rooting a number and not just the positive. Okay? And that is it. So let me know if you guys have any questions.